Vindobona, 170 CE. As Marcomannic raids strained Rome's northern frontier, the empire faced a deeper crisis, feeding its legions across hostile terrain. Securing 0.8 kg of grain per soldier per day became a logistical war of its own, stretching the annona system to its limits. Rations included the unloved Pascha sour wine diluted to keep men hydrated. In the frozen Danubian castra, spoilage, foraging failure, and overextended supply lines bred mutiny risk. Even seasoned vexilli grew restive when promised wheat failed to arrive. With imperial authority fragile under Marcus Aurelius, food, not steel, became the army's greatest weakness. Starvation stirred discontent far from the Senate's gaze. In the early centuries of Empire Rome's war machine marched not only on discipline and iron but on grain. Principally wheat triticum, this humble crop sustained the empire's legions from Britannia to Arabia. Under the Republic, soldiers had often foraged or purchased their own supplies, but as campaigns lengthened and posts grew distant, Augustus codified military rationing into a centralized system, the annona militaris. It was a logistical revolution. Rank-and-file soldiers drew state-provided grain, often shipped by river or sea, requisitioned from conquered provinces, and catalogued by imperial officers. This grain ensured stability, a daily allowance of moldy of flour distributed across legions and auxilia, converted into bread in camp ovens, or pistrina, under the watch of centurions. But the farther Rome extended its frontier into forests of Pannonia or highlands of Armenia, the more brittle this system became. River routes froze in winter, roads became bandit trails in spring thaws. Caracalla's empire-wide civitas in 212 CE flooded Rome's ranks with provincials and increased reliance on native auxiliary cohorts stretched across vastly varied terrains. Yet the supply system lacked the same adaptability. Uniform grain standards clashed with regional diets and harvesting cycles. Governors tasked with meeting quotas, often imposed without regard to local famine or war destruction, turned to coercion. Grain levies fractured rural economies, pulling cultivators from market exchange into forced contribution. In provinces like Moesia and Noricum, native elites, decurions and princeps civitatum, grew rich, hoarding and reselling, requisitioned grain even as soldiery along the limes chewed moldy barley. With overstretched lines and stratified command, bribery and shortfall became routine. Soldiers posted to the Danube shared rumors of corruption in Capua and collusion in Alexandria. Trust in the annona eroded. Morale suffered, and a hungry legion, like any army, was more susceptible to revolt, to recruitment by rivals, or to apathy in the face of foreign incursion. The grain furrow carved through empire suddenly seemed less a lifeline and more a fault line waiting to crack. Winter on the Danubian frontier held a silence more fatal than battle. By the year 170 CE, as Marcus Aurelius waged the bitter Marcomannic Wars, the machinery of Rome's military power strained against the frozen sinews of its own logistics. Grain, the foundation of the Roman army's annona militaris, could not move swiftly enough across the Istover Alpine routes from Italia to Vindobona and Carnuntum. Mule convoys stalled in deep snow. River transport along the Danube was frozen or exposed to raids. The empire's famed lines of supply, built with the precision of the cursus publicus, were no match for the Pannonian cold. As supplies dwindled, vexillations deployed deep beyond the limes found themselves cut off not only from bread but from firewood and warmer clothing. Centurions scoured friendly tribal lands for food, but foraging turned quickly to plunder. Auxiliary units of Dacian origin, seasoned but unpaid, began to desert or turn on their commanders. The allegiance of local tribes, Subic, Cotini, and Bari, crumbled under the weight of Roman requisitions. Fields were stripped bare before spring storehouses emptied. Starving civilians fled or allied with enemy chieftains. Germanic warbands, withheld from winter action by climate now guided by defectors, struck isolated outposts with precision. With each failed convoy and each sacked village, Rome's administrative faith in provincial cooperation faltered. Commissarii sent from Upper Mosia to coordinate supply returned with rebukes and threats, not grain. The emperor issued new mandates for seasonal storage points at Pano Brightio and Morava, but they came too late for the garrisons already hollowed by snow and silence. The landscape had turned against the empire, and the legions bent beneath its weight. By spring, mutinous grumbling echoed across the Danubian forts, and enemy alliances thickened just beyond the tree line. The next campaign season would not begin with a march, but with hunger. Along the frostbitten frontiers of the Danube, the illusion of Rome's infinite supply unraveled grain by grain. In the early 3rd century CE, as imperial legions pushed deeper into marginal terrain in Norica Mosia and Upper Pannonia, the tributary rafts and packed convoys carrying grain from Italia or Egypt strained under distance delay and deceit. Stacked against ice-choked rivers and muddy road sacks ruptured. Grain absorbed damp from unsealed amphorae and wooden crates. Mold seeded itself in the wheat silos of remote castra, where fumigation was primitive and rodent control improvised. When bread-spoiled soldiers turned to barley, heavier, coarser, and ignominiously fit for mules. Barley, though a cultivated crop within Rome's agrarian calendar, lacked the caloric yield and palatability of wheat. Already derided by legionaries as an animal ration, its forced substitution in daily pools further eroded morale. Murmurs of preference and corruption traveled along the Rhine faster than the supply lists. Rumors that the Senate had ring-fenced grain stockpiles in Ostia and Capua for the streets of Rome, while the Danubian watch froze and starved. Such perceptions, when articulated by decurions and junior centurions, were not merely complaints, but the first notes of institutional breakdown. In the vacuum, provincial governors seized opportunity. In Hispania Tarraconensis and Rhaetia, even in isolated parts of Thrace, food supplies became currency. Governors who secured grain from local elites, sometimes through coercion, sometimes patronage, extended their authority beyond military jurisdiction. But such interventions brought competition with imperial logisticians and fiscal agents, fomenting rivalries within the bureaucracy. The annona militaris, once a unifying backbone of Roman logistics, was fracturing into regional power networks dependent on loyalty, not law. Beneath this strain, the line between supply and sedition dulled. When hunger gnawed, equitably discipline held. When it spared the urban and punished the legion, the frayed loyalty of the frontier began to unravel, and winter was not yet over. In the bitter winter of 170 CE, along the frozen banks of the Danube at Aquincum, modern-day Budapest, the weight of empire faltered. Amid deep snowdrifts and silent forests, vexations of Legio II Adiutrix received orders to move north to punish Marcomannic bands who had attacked Roman tributaries. But the soldiers did not move. There was no bread. For weeks, grain shipments from Sirmium had failed to arrive, stalled by swollen rivers and ambushes among icebound roads. Daily rations, modius allocations of wheat or barley, dwindled into nothing. The centurions, bound by disciplina militaris, but with empty storehouses behind them, could not compel obedience. When command no longer feeds, it no longer commands. Tensions rippled outward from the castra like cracks beneath a frozen lake. Decades of discipline of sacramentum, the oath sworn to emperor and eagle bent beneath hunger. The mutiny at Aquincum was brief but thunderous. At least 2 cohorts refused deployment. Some officers were confined to their tents, their authority revoked by sheer exhaustion. Only the sudden arrival of grain carts from Sirmium, spurred by an emergency cursus publicus relay, restored order. The legate, not named in surviving accounts, punished selected ringleaders but issued no mass executions. He understood the deeper cause lay not in sedition but starvation. The event reached the ears of Marcus Aurelius, then encamped near Carnuntum. He had weathered mutinies before, small flare-ups among auxiliary scouts or foreign levies. But this was a legio, a citizen legion seasoned and elite. If its loyalty could break under an empty stomach, what of the Rhine garrisons or the Syrian cohorts hemmed in by Parthian raiders? The annona militaris, once Rome's lifeline, now showed its vulnerabilities, overstretched, compromised, maladministered. If soldiers began to see grain not as ration, but as right, something owed rather than issued, the emperor knew discipline might give way to negotiation. Winter had passed, but the thaw revealed more than riverbanks. It revealed precedent. In the frost-clad forests beyond the Danube, where Rome's lines of supply thinned like the icy margins of the Rhaetian Alps, a harsh calculus emerged. Campaigning generals, deprived of regular grain convoys from Italia, and faced with the unpredictability of highland roads, turned to coercive guarantees. Among the Quadi, the Noricii and other semi-client peoples, Roman prefects began demanding local provision of food, wheat, cattle, dried meat. To ensure compliance, they seized dependents, often the wives, daughters, and sons of tribal leaders, as leverage. These figures, officially described in dispatches as protected guests, were in practice hostages. Their continued safety depended on the timely delivery of the annona militaris under terms the Romans considered just and the locals did not. The system functioned for a time. Granaries in Vindobona and Carnuntum swelled. Commanders reported fewer supply disruptions, but resentment festered. Among tribes whose honor revolved around sovereignty and kinship, this seizure of persons cut deeper than any lost tribute. In Noricum, shortfalls in grain quotas led to summary executions, acts remembered and retold by local priests. Among the Quadi, entire villages abandoned their lowlands, fleeing into the forests. The Druidi, whose influence remained strong among the Danubian Gauls, condemned the Romans' demands. These priest leaders framed the hostage practice as tyranny and sacrilege, an offense against both custom and divine order. Shrines were closed, omens read in broken entrails. A falling star over Brightio was interpreted as a curse. Bands of armed youths, inspired by spiritual resistance, raided outposts and torched Roman mule trains. Their chants echoed across the valleys, not for plunder, but for the return of bloodkin. Rome responded with punitive expeditions. Vexallations marched under banners darkened by smoke. The clash of scuda, the creak of frost-bitten Caligi, filled the hills. Yet the cycle bred diminishing returns. Each reprisal deepened rural hatred. Each campaign further clogged the cursus publicus and left roads less secure. By early winter, reports reached Sirmium of arson at a grain depot near Savaria. Smoke rose over the black pines. Cornua wailed into the dark, and the hostages, over 300 by some counts, had begun to vanish. By the mid-3rd century CE, the Roman military was stretched thin across unstable frontiers, its strength increasingly dependent on long, fragile supply lines. Under Emperor Decius, as Gothic tribes probed the Danubian limes and plague stalked the empire's interior, many legionary forts in the Balkans and Pannonia found themselves isolated not just by terrain, but by failing logistics. The wine rations of earlier centuries had long since become a rarity on campaign. In most outposts, soldiers drank pasca, a sour diluted mixture of vinegar, water, and residual wine, cheap and bacteriostatic, but dependent on careful storage. When improperly managed, however, pasca's safeguard became a threat. In the remote castra of Moesia and Dacia, where temporary camp prefects were often appointed from the lower ranks without veterinary or supply experience, barrels of the drink sat uncorked or inadequately sealed. Exposure to heat, rodents, and insects turned the liquid foul. Troops who drank from spoiled casks fell ill in large numbers. In some units, mortality rivaled that from combat. Lacking skilled medici and encamped in regions with limited fresh water and primitive latrines, the spread of disease accelerated. As despair deepened, suspicion flared. Blame turned outward. Native suppliers contracted locals. Many Dacian or Getic by heritage were accused of sabotage. Some legionaries, embittered and fearful believed these traitors to be in secret league with Gothic warbands. Unverified accusations hardened into policy. Camp prefects ordered arrests, and quartermasters with provincial ties were dismissed en masse. In Noricum and parts of Upper Moesia, entire logistic corps were purged under cover of illness containment. What began as a supply failure evolved into xenophobic retribution. Discipline suffered. Trust between Roman command and provincial communities eroded. And as the empire's enemies grew bolder, Rome's legions, more fractured within than faced by without, marched deeper into a crisis with mouths parched, eyes watchful, and casques no longer trusted. In the summer of 177 CE, the Nile failed. The annual inundation that fed the grain fields of Aegyptus came late and shallow. Without the flood, harvest shrank. From Alexandria's granaries to the harbors of Puteoli and Ostia, Rome's grain lifeline faltered. The prefect of Egypt and equestrian, with imperium second only to the emperor in this breadbasket province, grasped the danger immediately. Urban Rome, swollen with over 1 million mouths, was priority. The crowd could riot. The Senate could assign blame. The desert tribes could rise. He secured shipments northward, keeping the ships flowing along the Pelusiac arm and out through the Mare Nostrum toward Rome, not the frontiers. The Danubian and Syrian legions received a fraction of their expected allocation. Along the Limes, rationing began. Administrators turned on one another, procurators accused governors, legati blamed quartermasters. In the north, murmurs of betrayal. On Marcus Aurelius's order, an emergency requisition redirected grain from Africa Proconsularis and Mauritania Tingitana. Roman ships, once devoted to maintaining coastal watch, now bore wheat from Caesarea and Tingis. The military prefects grumbled, watching their literal defenses hollow. The Berber clans, long distrustful of Roman incursions, seized opportunity. Without the deterrent of a full garrison force, raiders crossed frontiers between rivers and ridges. Stations fell. Supply baths were looted. Roads over the Dorsale passed into hostile control. Shrines lay scorched, vexilla trampled by hoof and fire. At Rome, the tubi of the Praetoriani still signaled morning drills near the Castra Praetoria, but senators whispered of omens, lightning at the Capitoline, and vultures circling the Janiculum. Pliny the Elder once wrote, "Grain controls the world's breath." The breath now shortened. Even as the fleet carried food to Rome's porticus of plenty, the emperor knew what had been laid bare: the dependence of his legions on distant rivers and foreign harvests, fragile, seasonal, corruptible, and beyond the reach of a commander's sword. The frontiers waited snowbound and hungry for the next failure. By the late 2nd century CE, the balance between Rome's military appetite and its fiscal body had become unsustainable. The annona militaris, Rome's long-established system of provisioning troops with requisitioned grain, drew heavily upon provincial dioceses and logistical arteries already strained by geography and weather. As the empire expanded deeper into the less fertile northern zones, the cost of maintenance increased, and so too did political scrutiny from the Senate. Many senators whose wealth lay in Italian latifundia and rental dues now argued that endless frontier campaigning drained imperial finances at the expense of Italy's traditional dominance. Some proposed limiting the campaign season by statute. Others championed the use of temporary mercenaries whose contracts avoided year-round provisioning responsibilities. Yet their proposals met stiff resistance, not from generals but from Rome's own equestrian administrators. These equites, promoted through the Praefectura Annoni and financial procuratorships, now aligned with frontier legates and legionary commanders to defend imperial supply chains. Their positions depended on a functioning military bureaucracy, and they had more regular contact with soldiers in Germania or Syria than Senate benches in Rome. What emerged was not merely a bureaucratic debate, but an institutional fracture. The senatorial class, increasingly ceremonial and removed from military command, advocating retrenchment, the equestrian and provincial magistracies, holding the sinews of active administration, arguing that Rome's frontiers could not endure without continuous investment and grain flow. The rift deepened steadily, as military failures were blamed either on senatorial stinginess or imperial overreach. And while emperors continued to solicit senatorial legitimacy, in theory true authority increasingly lay in the hands of commanders and quartermasters flanked by equestrian accountants, not togaed aristocrats. The Senate still gave thanks and titles but fewer supplies. As the century turned, this ideological division between Rome's civilian elite and its armed provincial apparatus only widened, threatening the unity of imperial priorities amid rising tribal pressures and shrinking surpluses. By the early 270s CE, the Emperor Aurelian stood at a crossroads. His restoration of imperial territory, the defeat of Palmyra in the east, and the reclamation of the Gallic succession in the west had renewed Rome's territorial integrity. But control on parchment was fragile without bread in the mouths of soldiers. To stabilize loyalty among the frontier legions, Aurelian expanded the annona militaris. He did more than requisition grain. He ordered the construction of pastrina publica state-run bakeries embedded within key castra. This reform, both logistical and symbolic, promised fresh bread, alongside imperial authority, daily proof of Rome's restored order. Yet the cost fell far from the triumphant capital. In Hispania Tarraconensis and Gallia Lugdunensis, landowners saw their grain quotas rise sharply. The pressure to meet military demand collided with local harvest volatility and a thinning rural workforce. Aristocratic curials charged with organizing shipments sought relief by delaying convoys, bribing tabularii, and manipulating tax registers. Inland grain movement became stagnant, while quotas on parchment remained unfulfilled. The imperial response was swift. Aurelian dispatched fiscal procurators and military detachments to enforce collection, but discipline bred resistance. In rural Aquitania and along the Rhone Valley, armed retainers blocked convoys, villages emptied ahead of tax agents. By the winter of 274, shortfalls rippled outward. In Lugdunum and Massilia, public bread doles fell short of demand. Grain prices soared, markets thinned, and riots loomed. Faced with a fragile western interior and persistent murmurs among urban prefects, Aurelian made a costly decision. He recalled vexillation stationed along the Rhine, men meant to deter Alemannic incursions, and redirected them not against barbarians but bakers and hoarders. The legions had to police the empire's stomach before it could guard its borders. But every battalion pulled inland left another frontier woodline unwatched, another river crossing unguarded. Winter passed, but peace did not follow. By the late 270s, Roman commanders in the Balkans confronted a dire reality. It was not spears or siege that toppled Rome's outer defenses, but the failure of the food system. As Gothic incursions shattered the countryside of Moesia, and Thrace, the empire's ability to provision its legions collapsed under pressure. Grain harvests burned, river routes seized, villages emptied. The annona militaris, once the beating heart of imperial logistics, faltered in the wake of repeated plundering and the empire's own overreach. Isolated castellums, forts once symbols of Roman permanence on the Danubian line, were found crawling with vines or silenced by snowdrifts, their garrisons gone, not fallen in battle, but dispersed in desperate search of food. Following the death of Aurelian, no clear successor could muster both auctoritas and the grain. Claimants eyed the purple, but frontier commanders, answering not to Rome, but to their own furnished granaries, grew hesitant to move men without reliable supply. Across the Balkan limes, each dux or prefectus feared the same fate: soldiers too weak to fight, or worse, too hungry to obey. Subtraction from the granary meant subtraction from loyalty. Garrisons fed from local stores jealously guarded their grain, while requisition agents from the capital met resistance, delays, and in some cases steel. Even consular envoys were turned back from outposts where commanders argued the food belonged to their men alone. The annona had long bound the empire's armies into a single force. Now it loosened. The specter of rival loyalties rooted not in ideology, but in rations crept across the provinces. Without centralized provisioning, commanders devised their own logistics, some honest, some predatory. The Gothic threat was real, but more insidious was the slow breakdown of imperial coherence, as Rome's soldiers scattered not to engage the enemy, but to fill their bellies. The grain, once a tool of empire, was becoming a tool of division. And as the Balkan front frayed, so too did the fabric of command.